If you sculpt a magnificent marble statue in ancient Greece and it remains intact until 2024 AD, it's very likely that it will still be considered magnificent. If you paint an incredible painting in the 15th century and it remains intact until 2024, it will probably still be incredible. If you compose a masterful symphony in the 18th century, it may well last throughout the ages. If you make an honest-to-God true masterpiece film in 1976 starring Robert De Niro playing with guns in the mirror, there's a good chance that it'll be referenced by 3 billion other movies like Alvin and the Chipmunks for some reason. But can you say the same about Breakout, the video game that also came out in 1976? No. Video games as a medium do not age as well as others, largely because the scope of what they can achieve and the quality at which they can achieve it is directly intertwined with the level of sophistication of the technology powering it, while at the same time the principles of what works and what doesn't work do not have nearly the longevity of those other mediums. For all the incredible games that have been released over the years, the games that stand the test of time by modern standards are often the exception and definitely not the rule. And the ones that do are not always available on modern devices. And that's what remakes, re-releases, and remasters are for. To make a game either available on modern devices, playable by modern standards, or both. Or go insane and change everything. I've always been of the opinion that preservation will always be of the utmost importance for video games, especially on account of the fact that they are logistically complicated to preserve, and a re-release of any kind can be hugely helpful to that end. That is assuming they don't fuck it up. The first order of business when considering a remake should be essentiality, which is primarily determined by availability. Most people want a game to be re-released in some form because the original game in question is no longer available on modern hardware and costs $9 million on eBay. Even the most low-effort re-releases and remasters are often appreciated just a little bit, if for no other reason than making the game available again. There are a lot of games where people would be happy just to see them re-released even if nothing at all was changed or improved from the original. But for all the games that you'd love to see remastered or re-released, it's amazing how much time and resources seem to be spent on re-releases of games that don't need them at all. I still haven't gotten over The Last of Us Part 1. I feel like I must have brought this game up a million times by now for one reason or another. When I refer to the current generation of game consoles as the inessential generation, my use of that word was prompted by a review of that game, where that very word was used to describe it. The original Last of Us was remastered for PS4 already, and the PS5 is fully backwards compatible with PS4 games, and everybody owns 23 copies of that version of the game already because it came free with half of all PS4s ever sold. My brother is using them to build a tool shed. So this is a remake of a game that every single person on Earth could already play, which means if they haven't played it, at this point it's by choice. Neil, take a fucking hint. In the world of video games, that is inessential in the purest sense of the word. IGN has the best words. Better than GameSpot anyway.
The exaggerated swagger of a black teen.
At least they dramatically enhance the visuals. A lot of these re-releases don't do shit, like The Last of Us 2 for PS5. Digital Foundry went over this version with a fine-tooth comb, looking for improvements over the PS4 version running on PS5 hardware, and found the differences to be barely perceptible. And again, that game came out in 2020. That wasn't exactly a massively long time ago. I mean, I know it feels like it was, but it wasn't. I actually believe half of the PS5 exclusives are just PS4 games with like 2 improvements. Even Metal Gear Solid Delta isn't entirely necessary since they already made the Master Collection. Meanwhile, Bloodborne still doesn't have a performance mode while running on PS4 Pro or PS5, and it's only a matter of time until that one goes out of print, so you know, that's sweet. The only essential remaster they have is Demon's Souls, which is otherwise landlocked to the PS3. Meanwhile, you got Nintendo, who finally got their asses in gear, remastered Metroid Prime with these cracked out visual overhauls, and remade Thousand Year Door with all kinds of crazy enhancements. I don't want to glaze Nintendo too hard as the cool kids are saying, but really they could have just run the original games under an emulator and a lot of people would be happy, so to go the whole distance and dramatically overhaul these classic titles was as incredible as it was unexpected.
I really don't know what he said at the end of that sentence. I don't think he knows what he said either.
They also brought back Pikmin 1 and 2 with limited but still appreciated improvements. Being able to play all 4 Pikmin games on the Switch is a pretty great thing, and it's nice that the GameCube library is finally being acknowledged as much as it is. My personal feeling is that this era was Nintendo at their finest, so for these games to be landlocked to the now almost 23-year-old Cube would have been a travesty. They also brought back Skyward Sword, if you're into that kind of thing. Then there's Xbox. Now, to some extent, remaking Xbox titles is a little bit redundant because they've been unusually good about backwards compatibility. Better than the competition, at least. They've added compatibility all the way back to even the original Xbox, which is pretty crazy. Even PlayStation doesn't do that anymore. Of course, you still have to own the OG Xbox game to play it in the first place, and since they're often out of circulation and not every game is supported, it's still not a catch-all solution. But it's a pretty sweet move, and one that none of the other platforms can claim to have done, unless you count PC. Depending on how competent and feature complete the original release is, re-releasing PC games can be a little unnecessary because the technological infrastructure therein is typically more conducive to backwards compatibility by default. If you buy a game on Steam and your computer is struggling with it, you can load it onto an upgraded PC in the future and play it at higher settings and performance than you could previously. The game isn't remastered in this case, you just turn the settings up because you can. Compare this to a cross-generational console game where you usually have to buy the entire game again, even though they basically just turn the settings up. Backwards compatibility is an important thing to consider with respect to availability so that remastered versions of games don't become unavailable, because then you're back at square zero. Unfortunately, that's already happened to a lot of re-releases, and we've gotten to the point where sometimes we have to re-release the re-releases. One thing that pisses me off is when the original version of the game is available, but then they suddenly delist it from digital storefronts so they can sell you their remaster instead, which generally costs way more money, artificially removing the availability factor to make the new version a necessity when they didn't have to. This is about the GTA Definitive Edition. Until this came out, you could just buy the original versions on Steam. You cannot do that anymore, so if you want to play these games on PC, you have to buy the Definitive Trilogy, which is not definitive and is not good, even. It's really bad. It is pure luck that I picked up Vice City and San Andreas before that happened. As for 3, I just emulated it. Rockstar can shit its ass. Essentiality has many pillars. Availability is just the most important one. The second most important pillar is the state of the game. As I alluded to in the beginning, the thing about older games is that they often tend to be dated in many respects, not just in terms of visuals, but also gameplay and controls. Games that you remember being super polished, cutting-edge masterpieces when you first played them may turn out to be barely functional by modern standards. There are a lot of things nobody noticed or cared about back in the old days because we hadn't established the standards that we have now, so there wasn't really anything to compare it against. The original Thousand Year Door, for instance, is a great game that's a lot of fun to play, at least I think, but it's held back by a lot of ball-busting backtracking, which is an issue I was never fully conscious of until I watched a friend play through it for the first time. The remake didn't remove it entirely, but they did cut down on it pretty substantially with all these new pipe systems and a highly improved fast travel station which the fans are calling the General White Room, and if you haven't reached that part of the game yet, you'll know exactly what we're talking about soon enough. They also let you retry floors in the Pit of 100 Trials if you die. I would say that trivializes the achievement of going through the pit, but I've also had my run ended on floor 99 because of a gold daisy before, so I don't really blame them for adding that in. There are also little things that are more streamlined than they used to be, like swapping partners or even cooking recipes with Zesty or even the Mailbox SP, which just gives you a little ring every now and again instead of stopping Mario dead in his tracks like it used to. It's little stuff, but when there's a huge volume of little stuff, it adds up to a lot and definitely makes it hard to go back to the original. I was worried about the frame rate though. The OG ran at 60 FPS and the new one runs at 30, which I thought might make the action commands wonky, but it actually wasn't too distracting in the end. Controls are a very important thing to consider. Today, if the game involves guns, you already know what all the controls are before you even pick up the controller, except for the crouch button because nobody can agree on what the best button for crouching is. Back in the PS2 days and before, however, game controls were completely up in the air until you actually played it. It was a time of experimentation, and the thing about experiments is that they're all about learning things. In particular, what works and maybe what doesn't work. One series that loved to experiment was Metal Gear. These games were insane with all kinds of mechanical versatility and little gameplay details that you can completely miss because everything interacts with each other in weird ways that you might not even understand at first. Metal Gear Solid 3 might be one of the greatest stealth action games ever made, but when I first played it on the PS2, I was truly baffled by the controls. First off, the camera was locked to this weirdo overhead view, which was extremely unhelpful in many situations. There were a lot of weird mechanics that you had to toy around with, like to throw things further, you push the square button harder, except that's a nebulous metric until you've done a lot of toying around with it first. If you press the wrong button too hard, you could slit a dude's throat on accident when you were just trying to choke him out like the non-lethal angel that you are. It was a really noble experiment with one of the PS2's more underappreciated innovations, but it was also way too error-prone in my opinion. Kinda similar to all the Wii games that relied on waggle commands where you could do some shit you weren't trying to do just because you got the fucking hiccups. The Subsistence and HD collection versions of Snake Eater added in a more universal camera system, but controls-wise, everything else was largely the same. I never fully got used to it back then, and there was actually a time when MGS4 was my favorite game in the series from the gameplay end, for no other reason than the fact that the controls were normal. Despite the game being far less mechanically dense and intricate than 3, having a control scheme that I felt I could rely on was enough to make it better to me. But then you have Delta, which gives the option of a more modern control scheme. I think to combine that with the mechanical density of Snake Eater could well make it the greatest Metal Gear experience since Phantom Pain, and I am praying to the very energy of the universe that this sentence doesn't age poorly. Although the competition isn't exactly fierce. What about GoldenEye? When this first came out, it was celebrated as being possibly the first console-based FPS game to actually work properly, due in no small part to the N64's control stick. If that sounds bizarre to you, try playing Quake on the Sega Saturn, and then you'll understand where they were coming from. GoldenEye was already experimenting with a lot of things, including optional control setups that bear a noticeable resemblance to what would eventually become the now ubiquitous dual thumbstick setup, with the option of moving with the C buttons and free looking with the stick, or even using two controllers at once, but it wasn't until the unreleased Xbox 360 version of the game got leaked that a truly modernized GoldenEye experience became a reality. We will talk about the Activision one later. It is effortless on a modern controller when it's actually been designed for it, combined with the dramatic performance improvements that make the controls more instantaneous by proxy. Trying to drag the crosshair around to defend your position at the control center when the game was falling to 9 FPS was a nightmare. It really is a damn shame this version never officially came out. Ocarina of Time, you had the water temple where you had to pause and change the boots you had equipped every 3 seconds, which made an already confusing and maddening dungeon a nightmarish and cumbersome crawl through a watery hell. Until the 3DS version came out and made the iron boots an item that you could just map to a button and swap on a dime. That was a good move. I also love how the text moves faster than 3 feet per century. Playing through the original version, I always found myself spamming the A button like a madman, hoping in vain that it would just make the text go a little bit faster. Doom 3 BFG Edition added the great feature of being able to hold both the flashlight and the gun at once instead of having to swap between the two like a dumb bitch. It's quite incredible how dramatically this little change improved the experience. I barely even cared about the visual upgrades at that point. The most frustrating re-releases are the ones that do almost nothing to fix the most unbearable elements of the original game. The original PS2 GTA trilogy were groundbreaking, forward-looking titles that were held back by insane jank and a lot of missions that you'd think the developers forgot to playtest. The definitive trilogy could have added checkpoints or improved the wonky mechanics, but instead of doing all that, they made the graphics better.
So, you full of crap or what? What?
When you re-release a game by any definition, whether that be a remaster, remake, or whatever you want to call it, there is an expectation that the original spirit of the game is maintained to the best of the developer's ability. It has been known to happen where certain elements were changed that people didn't want them to change, such as writing signs in Comic Sans in the Silent Hill collection. The problems with this collection, from what I understand, weren't so much artistic deviations as just general development missteps. Apparently they were given incomplete source code. That's not good. People were also frustrated at the re-recorded lines with different actors, and even though I haven't played these games, I can definitely sympathize with that because I played Star Fox 64 3D. In almost every respect, that's an excellent way to play the game, but I wasn't that big of a fan of the voice acting. The original had a lot of memorable dialogue, and the delivery just wasn't always there, at least I think.
I'll do my best. Andros won't have his way with me.
I guess I should be thankful.
Who are you guys?
Here, Star Fox.
Cocky little freaks!
It might have been nice to have the option of the original voice lines, but as they say, you know, people in hell want ice water. Localizations can complicate things. Do you just translate everything directly with no concern over how awkward it might sound in English, or do you riff on it completely until it's unrecognizable from the original source material? Those are the only options, there is no in between. Mother 3 is a game that I would kill for an official localization, re-release, or even remake of, although I don't know if I should. Mother 3 is a game that goes to some crushingly dark places and has a lot of really offbeat humor and themes, and I don't know that these things would survive a modern adaptation, at least not in their entirety. Pikmin 2's re-release had a lot of surprising censorship in it, which is how I learned that WOG is not only a real word that exists, but is actually an ethnic slur to refer to non-white people. Okay, I swear to God I didn't know that. Some of these changes are like whatever, but there are others that are just kinda stupid, things that had actual relevance to the story, like Louie's difficult childhood and being forced to eat bugs and shit. They really cleaned this game up, you know, which I'm not too happy about. Pikmin is supposed to be a dirty game, you know what I mean? It's a real scum bastard game. The treasure and enemy logs added a ton of flavor and character to the game that is unfortunately less potent in the new versions, and I truly do believe it's worse off for it. A lot of people don't give that much of a shit, and I guess I can't be way too mad at them. I mean, I value the writing in a Pikmin game. Am I really gonna pretend that I'm the normal one here? Updating the graphics is a pretty obvious move with any kind of re-release, whether it's a simple resolution boost or an overhaul of models and textures. Even so, respect for the art direction is a huge factor, which is why Metal Gear Delta lets you add the piss filter back in. One big criticism I hear about Sonic Adventure DX is how Sonic looks. Instead of being a dark blue bitch, now he's a shiny blue bitch. Shadow of the Colossus, I remember seeing the remastered PS4 version of the game and saying, "Ah man, this looks amazing." Then my brother saw it and he was like, "Yeah, this is shit actually." He was largely fixated on the character design of Wander and how he looked too much like a cute anime character. I didn't get it entirely, but he's a much bigger fan of the game than I am, so he's probably right, the same way I'm right about Paper Mario and the stupid white outlines. Going back to Thousand Year Door, that remake has such tremendous respect for the original vision, holding on to the original art direction while modernizing it to an absurd degree. The soundtrack is a little more subjective though. I mean, 90% of the time it's awesome. There are all kinds of entirely new tracks, and some tracks even change depending on the context, kinda like Banjo-Kazooie. The effort put into it is definitely above and beyond, but there are also moments where the original atmospheric attitude of the music is sacrificed so they can add heavy guitar riffs and stuff like a Smash remix. It sounds badass, but it often clashes with the mood that the original song was going for. But it turns out the developers knew I was thinking that before I even thought it, which is why they added in a badge in the badge store for 1 coin that lets you change the soundtrack back to the original tunes. That is a good move. They know how passionate the fan base is for this game and could predict well in advance that the new remixes might not click for a lot of people. And what's really cool is that all of that stuff can just as easily be said of the earlier Super Mario RPG remake. It's incredible how faithful the art direction is to the original version despite being in 3D now. The only setback with Thousand Year Door potentially is some of the writing, which suffers from a similar problem as Pikmin, where things as insignificant as like characters calling each other stupid or something are changed so as to not offend 3 people who would genuinely be offended by that. As a big believer in free speech, I strongly feel that Bowser has the right to call his minions Tubby and to call Cammy a moron, and if you don't like that, you can go to Waffle Kingdom, I guess. And while we're at it, I still can't believe they removed the Bruce Lee line from Mario RPG. Come on, Nintendo, get in the game! What about Halo? The remastered visuals are very shiny and glossy looking, but debatably impede the readability of environments and combat situations. Thankfully, you can swap between the old and the new just by hitting a button. Again, it's just nice to have an option like that. One game I wish had that option was Conker's Bad Fur Day. From a purely technical perspective, the Xbox version runs laps around the N64 version and it's not even close. Controls as well as visuals and even music for that matter are all at an objectively more robust level on Xbox. Both versions of the games are some of the most technically impressive titles on both of their respective platforms, which is a tremendous accomplishment on its own, and I would never wish to take that away from them. That being said, I just like the way the original version looks more. The Xbox version looks gritty and rustic, which can be cool in the right moments, but I wonder if it misses the strength of the original. The absurdity of Conker's Bad Fur Day is its vague aesthetic symmetry to Banjo-Kazooie being completely at odds with the actual subject matter of the game, which includes alcohol, extreme gore, and big titties, and that angle becomes compromised when the art direction is changed. The Xbox version has a lot going for it, but for these reasons, I don't think it can replace the original. Some remakes are more like a fundamentally new video game altogether that might retread many of the ideas of the original but in a completely different way. These remakes don't really work as a replacement of the original game so much as an alternative take on it. Resident Evil is a good example. 2 and 3 were both brought back as super modernized traditional over-the-shoulder third-person shooters. Some people will say that the tank controls from the original make it scarier because it makes you panic and think on your feet harder, but really, I'd rather be scared of the actual zombies than the controller. The originals have their place in history, and they definitely have their fans to this day, but I think a lot of people would prefer the newer versions instead. But then there's stuff like Final Fantasy VII Remake, which is an entirely new video game altogether, turning it into a full-on action RPG and having entirely new or otherwise dramatically changed story elements and real-time cutscenes and that line about the pizza. This is in a completely different category of remakes because it's not really something that can replace the original game. Final Fantasy VII was just such an iconic and beloved game that I have to assume a lot of people just dreamed of what it would look like if it were redone with the technical and artistic prestige of a modern video game. There are very few video games that can claim to be beloved enough for people to want it to be rebuilt in a completely different way that is not at all similar to the original version, even though they love the original version. But love is complicated. I've seen commentary from some Nintendo fans that they'd love to see a Final Fantasy VII Remake style reimagining of Ocarina of Time one day because the story and the world and all that are so dearly beloved that just imagining what it might look like with modern Unreal 5 looking ass makes their hearts explode on the spot. That, and we've been on Breath of the Wild mode for 7 years, and I think people just really want a classic style 3D Zelda again. Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes is an interesting one. It's a full-on beat-for-beat remake of MGS1 developed by Silicon Knights exclusively for the GameCube of all consoles. It lifted several mechanics found in MGS2, but without really rebalancing the game around them, which makes for a less polished experience. It's generally not considered to be the better version for those reasons, although it's kinda hard for me to complain about that because I have played the original game where you don't have those luxuries. I played it on extreme difficulty, and it is beyond infuriating. I swear, you will hurt yourself playing this. But I guess it wouldn't be extreme if it didn't piss you off. Metal Gear purists have these conversations a lot, and it wouldn't surprise me if we see a huge discourse over Metal Gear Delta adding crouch walking to Snake Eater. Even though the gameplay loop and world design are basically the same as the original, the dramatically changed mechanics and cutscenes make it different enough that it stands alone. A complaint that's a little more silly in my book is how over the top the cutscenes are. I've seen people say that with their whole ass. I don't know what series they think this is that's something to complain about. GoldenEye Reloaded was an interesting case. The premise for this game's development and marketing leaned heavily on this idea that the original GoldenEye for the N64 was one of the greatest FPS games of all time. Although, while most people were aware of its accomplishments, I don't know how universal that opinion actually was in 2010. By this time, you had Halo 1 through 3 and Modern Warfare going strong, so I don't know how many people were gooning over GoldenEye for reasons beyond nostalgia. Swooning. I meant swooning. Whatever the case may be, it was marketed as the return of a legendary video game franchise, a new GoldenEye game. And it was basically a Call of Duty campaign that loosely followed the events of the GoldenEye movie, except they replaced Pierce Brosnan with Daniel Craig because he's the current Bond actor. For all the hype and that epic-ass trailer they showed at Nintendo's E3, nobody really talks about this game anymore.
Let's say that after 13 years of gaming innovation, a new GoldenEye game is coming up.
Oh my god! Yes!
Watch out! Oh! Who's driving this car? Sean Bean? Oh, wait.
Structurally, it's not remotely similar to the original. The original game was very open and didn't force your hand very much. It was defined by a real sense of freedom and self-directed discovery where you had to figure things out on your own. Reading through the mission dossier like an actual agent so you know what to look for in the actual mission and what to do. And it was happy to let you fail and have to abort the entire thing and start all over again. It's not a perfect game by today's standards, but in today's context, it's still very much its own thing. GoldenEye Reloaded is just Call of Duty. You follow waypoints, do everything as it's told to you in the moment, watch a cutscene of an explosion and then your ears start ringing. Then you shoot a bunch of nondescript goons from behind a roadblock. And it's not a bad video game objectively, but for all the marketing and how many times they kept saying, "Return of a classic, new GoldenEye," or whatever, it's kinda baffling that it's just Call of Duty. What about Super Mario 64? This is a hugely important video game. Few other games can claim to have had as much influence on the industry as that one. It seems like an obvious move to remake a game like that, which is where Super Mario 64 DS came in. This is a weird one. When this first came out, it was just insane to me that I was able to play an actual 3D video game on a handheld. In 2004, my idea of handheld games was basically just portable Super Nintendo. So to see a game like Mario 64 playable on a handheld with those kinds of updated graphics, it was like a magic trick. The obvious question is, how does this work with a D-pad? It doesn't. While a bit of an exaggeration, it'll just never feel as good to play a 3D game on a D-pad, but nobody gave a shit back then. There was a period where it just seemed like the objectively superior version because you could play as 4 characters and there were 30 extra stars and it was portable. Today, I think this game still has value, not as a retread of Mario 64, but rather on its own terms. A lot of the mechanical versatility, fluidity, and experimentation you got with the original game, which is one of the things that keeps it so relevant to this day, is kinda missing because the physics and mechanics are way more stiff and stilted. So the trade-off of all the extra content becomes its saving grace. Gamers tend to monetarily evaluate games at a lower level the older they become, and that can often extend even to modern re-releases of older titles. The price points for Nintendo's re-releases are all over the place. Metroid Prime had the decency to only charge $40 despite looking and playing better than ever before, while at the same time charging full price for Skyward Sword, which doesn't have half the improvements of Metroid. Luigi's Mansion 2 is a full-priced game despite originally being a $40 3DS game. Game developers love to take your money, so to balance this, sometimes they try to sweeten the deal with bonus stuff that isn't there in the original game. If it's a re-release of a relatively modern game, sometimes they might include all the DLC if applicable, which is lazy but still nice and convenient to have. Collections can be a pretty sweet deal, like the Sly trilogy. These were some exemplary PS2 platformers and they got brought back in HD. They're not super ambitious remakes or anything like that, but it was 3 games in one. That's just a nice deal. The subconsciously lower value of these older games becomes more abstract when they're in a collection like this. Rare Replay has 30 games, ranging from old-ass ZX Spectrum games like Jetpack all the way up to Banjo Nuts and Bolts. If you were to evaluate each of these games, the price range would be all over the place. I remember buying the Borderlands Handsome Collection for PS4 back in the day. That was a full-priced game, but it was Borderlands 2 and the pre-sequel, complete with all the DLC and up to 60 FPS as long as you look at the floor and don't do anything. It came out only a year after the pre-sequel and was objectively a far better value. I hated myself for buying the original game at launch on PS3. I didn't know they were gonna do that. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe is another great example, where the original game was the best-selling game on the Wii U, so it sold like 12 copies. What better thing to do with a game like that than re-release it on a console that people actually bought and include all the DLC? Ocarina of Time 3D includes both the original version of the game and the Master Quest version that wasn't playable since the GameCube days, and they even added this boss rush mode where you can fight all of the bosses just for fun. Pikmin 3 Deluxe added in a co-op campaign mode, which I've never played, but it seems like such an obvious thing to have in a Pikmin game that I'm surprised Pikmin 4 didn't have anything like that. At least ROM hackers are catching up. I think for me though, the best example is Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury. The original Mario 3D World is considered by some to be one of the greatest 3D Mario games ever made. I could never get behind that sentiment, so charging $60 for that game years after release would have been a raw deal for me, except when you take the fundamentals of that game and graft it onto a giant dense singular level as they did in Bowser's Fury, it very quickly becomes something far greater than I could have ever expected. So yes, they're charging me full price for 3D World, which is a Wii U game, but it comes with a brand new 3D Mario experience, and it's damn good. It's good as hell. Banjo-Kazooie and Tooie on Xbox Live Arcade added a new special version of Stop and Swap, which is a feature that was supposed to exist in the original games, but as far as we know, never made the final cut. In case you're not a Banjo buff, this was a feature that would have allowed you to unlock goodies between both games by swapping the cartridges while the console was still turned on, which is insane, and Nintendo told them not to do it, because they didn't want people to break their consoles. But of course, as you all know, Microsoft on the other hand doesn't really care that much about whether or not their consoles break down. The later Rare Replay had even more bonus stuff like developer commentaries and never before seen footage of the pre-release versions of the games. Thousand Year Door Remake comes with all kinds of bonus unlockable content that does not exist in the original. I remember spending many days 100%ing the original game back in the day, and it's nice to know that if I just waited for them to remake it, I could have done all that and actually gotten something for it in return. On top of this, a lot of the story beats and cutscenes have been dramatically embellished with new effects and details. I especially love how your entire party is present for some of the more important cutscenes. Basically, the entire thesis of this video is that the Thousand Year Door remake is really good, and if you haven't played it yet, it's because you're a bozo. Some remasters improve a bunch of stuff, but actually end up removing content, which is a real punch in the gut, especially when it's marketed as definitive. GTA is the obvious low-hanging fruit, with all kinds of music missing from the original releases, because it turns out that between having the second and sixth best-selling video games in history under their belt, both of which have microtransactions and shit, Rockstar apparently just doesn't have the money to pay for the licenses. But even something like Metal Gear Solid HD Collection will be missing stuff, like the snakeboarding minigame where you do pop shove-its on Big Shell as Raiden. I'm serious. That was a feature in the special versions on PS2. That's not a deal breaker with all the other stuff on that collection, but when it comes to re-releases, there are a few things as frustrating as when a game is re-released more than once, and no one single version seems to be entirely complete. Up to this point, this video has been primarily focused on re-releases and remasters that actually exist, but what about the ones that don't exist? Well, that list is getting shorter by the day. A lot of the re-releases that I've been wanting for a while have already been made now. One game I think about a lot is Banjo-Kazooie, although it does lack the primary essentiality pillars on the grounds that it's available on modern hardware through re-releases and is still largely a pretty reliable game by today's standards. A fully blown remake could be a neat idea though, if for no other reason than to be able to say that Banjo-Kazooie isn't dead. It won't get remade, but you know what will? Fucking Croc. There is no harmony in the universe. Between the wealth of remasters, remakes, and re-releases that Nintendo has made this generation, in addition to the Nintendo Switch Online service, Nintendo has done a surprisingly good job at making the Switch the ultimate portal to their entire repertoire up to this point. Way more than they've been able to do in previous generations. But they still have a couple of blind spots here and there to fill in. Luigi's Mansion 1 seems like an obvious move considering they have 2 and 3. Mario Kart Double Dash would also be pretty good, while Mario Kart re-releases might seem redundant with Mario Kart 8 having everything in it. The dynamic of Double Dash doesn't exist in any other game in the series, so I feel that it's worth revisiting. F-Zero GX is hugely and almost unanimously celebrated by everyone who's played it as far as I can tell, so it's kinda baffling that they haven't brought that one back yet. Star Fox Assault is another GameCube game that I've seen a lot of praise for. They should bring back that one too. Really, they should just do something with Star Fox, you know what I mean? Wind Waker and Twilight Princess were both released on Wii U but still haven't made it to Switch at the time of writing this video. Super Paper Mario is one that I would love to see come back, and I don't think it's impossible now that we have Thousand Year Door. And what about Super Mario Galaxy 2? Many people think that this one is even better than the first one, yet Nintendo completely snubbed it in the 3D All-Stars collection. Like, geez, what were they thinking? I already brought up Mother 3, although I think a remaster trilogy of all 3 Mother titles would be nuts. Every time I see one of those HD 2D re-releases of Dragon Quest for NES or even the Mario RPG remaster, I wonder if something like that could be done for the Mother series. Mother 1 especially has a lot of infuriating shit. I don't know if you've ever tried to play this game, but it is nonsense. The balancing and the RNG and the stupid shit where you can't use certain quest items if a certain character is dead, it's rough. But at this point, a remake trilogy would be fire. It's not like there's zero demand for it either. How many indie RPGs claim influence from Earthbound? All of them. And why in the hell not, right? They remade friggin' Famicom Detective Club. I'm the only person who knew that series even existed because one of the games was in Wikipedia's big-ass list of games featuring Mario. But you know what game really needs a re-release? Rayman 2. Back in the day, that game was getting re-released on every single console known to mankind, and then they just suddenly stopped. By now, this game should have at least 20 more re-releases. King's Field, now that's what I would like to see. I went and played through these games out of curiosity because I beat every Dark Soul and wanted to try the series that inspired it. They definitely have some issues, but I actually really enjoyed them in the end. Ideally, I'd like to see a new King's Field altogether, but they'll never do it because they're cowards. They made too many Dark Souls and they went soft. Shadow of the Air Tree is too easy. It's so easy I didn't even bother beating it. That's the only reason I didn't beat it, because it's so easy that it insulted my intelligence. Now that From Software brought back Armored Core, I think it'd be a good time for them to bust out the old classics, and considering that they're a world-class game developer now, I sincerely doubt I'm the only one who's curious about their older titles. As long as video games are a medium that is as prone to obsolescence as they are, remakes and re-releases are still going to be a relevant concept, and as is already happening in some cases, they're gonna have to start remaking the remakes. If I racked my brain really hard, I could think of more games that deserve a re-release of some kind, but at this point, I'm gonna leave the question with you. Which games do you think should be re-released? Which games do you think need a remaster or a remake? Which remakes should get remakes? Do you think Silent Hill 2 using Comic Sans makes the game scarier? Where do you stand on piss filters? Tell me your thoughts on the matter.